Are you sure that every decision you make is truly your own? It turns out that most of our choices are already programmed before we even notice. In psychology, there's a phenomenon called the illusion of choice. It seems like you're in control of the situation, but in reality, your brain has already made the decision for you. For example, when you walk into a cafe and choose from 24 types of coffee, your attention is automatically drawn to the items in the center of the list from the very beginning. This is confirmed by experiments conducted by Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky. When people are asked to choose something from a long menu, most of them pick items that are just above or just below the middle, even if they didn't know about these drinks before. Back in the mid-20th century, psychologists conducted a rather strange experiment. A group of volunteers was asked to choose between two absolutely identical photographs of people, being told that one of them showed a kinder person. Only a few minutes later did it become clear that the photos were identical. Yet almost all participants began convincing themselves that there were differences, even providing arguments in favor of the kinder-looking face. Their brains had already made the decision before their consciousness did, and even created a vivid justification for it. Another striking example came from New York supermarkets. There, scientists noticed that if certain products are placed at eye level, their sales increase sharply. Although shoppers insist that they make their choices entirely on their own, this phenomenon was tested again. In stores, chocolate was simply moved from the top shelf to the middle one, and in just 1 week, sales increased by almost 1.5 times. The brain chooses what is easier to notice before we even start to reason logically. Sometimes the illusion of choice even works with music. In one experiment, customers at a wine shop were played French songs, and sales of French wine suddenly increased. A few days later, they played German music, and immediately more customers started choosing German wines. And none of them realized that the music was influencing their choice. And while it may seem that our brain is a complex and precise analytical machine, behind the scenes it often makes decisions before we even realize it. When it feels like everything is under control, in reality many details have already been arranged for us by invisible mechanisms that guide our attention, mood, and even our taste. But things get even more interesting when just a single moment can completely change our choice. And sometimes it can do so forever. At the very moment when a person first meets someone or something, the brain initiates a process that scientists call the first impression effect. Harvard University studies have shown that the brain needs less than a third of a second to decide whether it finds someone likable or not. In an experiment involving Yale University students, they were shown a series of photographs of completely unfamiliar people and asked to instantly determine whether the person was trustworthy or not. It turned out that the first half second completely shapes our attitude, and even long conversations or logical arguments rarely manage to change it. There was a story involving employers in Chicago. The same candidates were invited to interviews in different orders and with different hairstyles or clothing colors. Those who went first were more likely to receive high scores, even when their skills were identical. One of the most striking cases happened during a musicians' competition for the Boston Symphony Orchestra. Until the 1970s, women almost never made it through the selection process. But when auditions became blind, with musicians playing behind the screen, women began winning competitions 3 times more often, and the judges admitted that their initial visual impression had previously influenced their decisions unconsciously. During a court hearing in Los Angeles, a group of jurors was shown photos of the suspect before the trial began. Those who looked more trustworthy received lighter sentences, even though the charges and evidence were identical. In one San Francisco restaurant, waiters deliberately wear either light or dark uniforms, and the difference in tips reaches nearly 20%. Customers, without realizing it, judge the service based on their first impressions, even if the subsequent service is exactly the same. In a clothing store in Houston, employees changed the order in which items were displayed in the window. The items that ended up in front were bought almost twice as often, and customers admitted that they simply felt those items matched their style. Even the color of a business card or logo can influence the outcome of an important business meeting. Psychologists from Cambridge have proven that the color blue increases trust by 40% in the first seconds of contact. The effect of a first impression does not forgive mistakes and does not give a second chance. Everything that happens in those brief moments already lays the foundation for decisions that will seem conscious and carefully considered, but in reality remain hooked by the subconscious. But an even more inexplicable phenomenon is when the brain is able to make a choice without any deliberation at all, as if an inner voice suggests the right answer even before logic kicks in. This inner voice saved the lives of pilots during World War II. Intuition was observed in action when pilots, without having time to consciously analyze the instrument readings, would suddenly change course and dodge enemy shells, only realizing afterward that they had done it automatically. Later analysis showed that the brain was picking up on subtle details from the engine noise and the color of flashes, and the decision would arise as a feeling of danger. In New York, firefighter George Rayner in the early 80s led his team out of a building where there were no visible signs of danger simply because he felt that something was wrong. A few seconds later, the floor collapsed. Psychologists found that he had subconsciously picked up on a barely noticeable overheating of the floor and an unusual sound, and his brain signaled him to leave immediately. During student exams at Princeton, some students made decisions in a matter of seconds and received the same scores as those who spent a long time carefully thinking through each answer. A study by the University of California. Volunteers were shown complex problems and asked to solve them either instantly or after deliberation. It turned out that intuitive decisions were not only faster, but sometimes even more accurate. The brain instantly drew on accumulated experience and the slightest details of the situation, which are impossible to keep in conscious attention. At one hospital in Dallas, a rare disease was diagnosed in a patient after a doctor sensed something was wrong, even though the test results gave no reason for concern. Later, it turned out that the subconscious had noticed an unusual skin tone and a barely perceptible smell that the specialist couldn't put into words. Intuition works even when logic is powerless. In an experiment at Cambridge University, participants were shown people's faces and asked to guess who was lying. Those who trusted their initial gut reaction guessed correctly almost 20% more often than those who analyzed the details and built hypotheses. Intuitive decisions also manifest in everyday life. In Los Angeles, a real estate agent could determine within a minute which apartment was perfect for a client, even though he himself didn't know why. Later analysis showed that years of experience allowed him to instantly pick up on dozens of small details that are impossible to consciously account for. In Chicago, a car salesman could accurately identify his customer by a gesture or facial expression seconds before the conversation even began. And when it seems like intuition is something mystical, in reality, it is based on millions of impressions and tiny details that the brain processes behind the back of our consciousness. So sometimes a decision appears as if out of nowhere, but turns out to be the right one. However, there are situations when this inner voice no longer helps, especially when the fear of making a mistake is at stake, and the responsibility becomes too great. When the fear of making a mistake becomes the main thing in our minds, our decisions immediately change. At Harvard, they analyzed the behavior of doctors who were told that their diagnosis would be reviewed by experts. In these conditions, even the most experienced specialists began ordering additional tests and examinations just in case, even though standard practice would have been enough for an accurate diagnosis. A similar effect was observed among pilots who were about to take a qualification exam. Most of them chose the safest route, even if it was more time and fuel-consuming, just to avoid making a mistake under the commission's supervision. In New York, researchers observed how teenagers make decisions under the pressure of fear of making a wrong move. During a simple multiple-choice test, if students were told that points would be deducted for mistakes, their decision speed dropped by almost half, and the number of incorrect answers increased. In Chicago, managers of small startups were brought together for training sessions where they had to decide whether to invest in a risky but promising project. Those who were confronted with a warning about making mistakes, in most cases, chose the safest and most conventional option, even if the profit was minimal. One of the most remarkable experiments was conducted in London, where a group of volunteers was asked to choose between two identical products. But only in one group, a rule was added. Making the wrong choice would result in a small monetary penalty. As a result, participants took much longer to make decisions and more often chose the product that the consultant had recommended to them in advance, without even considering their own preferences. Similar experiments were repeated in different cities from Seattle to Dallas, and the result was always the same. When the fear of making a mistake appears, people are willing to trust someone else's opinion or follow instructions just to avoid being responsible for an error. In the world of Wall Street traders, the fear of losing money leads even experienced professionals to start copying their colleagues' decisions or shifting responsibility onto automated systems, turning off their own intuition. In the field of education, students at Princeton University were given difficult problems and warned that an incorrect answer would lower their final grade. The result, most students chose the simplest but not the most effective solutions, acting on the principle of better safe than sorry. A story from Texas. During training exercises, firefighters, knowing that points would be deducted for every mistake, acted more slowly and lost precious time. Yet in real-life situations, they make decisions instantly and often flawlessly. It turns out that as soon as responsibility becomes too apparent and the fear of making a mistake hangs directly overhead, our brain seems to hit the brakes. But even under such conditions, we still aren't completely free in our decisions. After all, our choices are often influenced not only by our own opinions, but also by the behavior of the surrounding crowd. Sometimes it seems like you're making the decision yourself, but in reality, the crowd has already made it for you. In the mid-1950s in Chicago, psychologist Solomon Asch conducted an experiment that later became a classic. A group of students was shown lines of different lengths and asked to choose which one matched the standard. Only one person was a real participant, the rest were Confederates. They would unanimously give the wrong answer. Almost 1 in 3 participants agreed with the majority, even when they could clearly see the mistake. The study was later repeated in many cities from Boston to Los Angeles, and the results were always similar. When everyone around us makes the same choice, our brain switches into imitation mode. In London in the early 2000s, sociologists observed the behavior of shoppers during sales. As soon as someone started picking clothes from a particular shelf, a line would immediately form there. Even though the choice was completely random, the majority of shoppers gravitated to the same spot. In Paris, an experiment was conducted with lines at cafes. If a waiter deliberately gathered a small crowd near an empty table, other patrons would confidently choose that spot, believing it to be the most popular. In New York's Times Square, a group of actors would stop and start looking up at the sky. Within a minute, dozens of random passers-by would join them, and after a few more minutes, dozens of people were trying to see what was happening above. In most cases, no one even understood the reason, but the internal feeling of if everyone is looking, then there must be something important kicked in instantly. On Wall Street, stock market traders regularly fell into the trap of the crowd effect. If one of the leading analysts started betting on certain stocks, the others, afraid of being left out, would rush to follow suit. As a result, an artificial wave of demand was created, even though there were no objective reasons for it. A similar effect was observed in the financial centers of Dallas and San Francisco. The logic of the crowd often replaced individual reasoning. In Chicago sports bars, researchers observed how fans chose their drinks. If a large order was placed at a neighboring table, within 5 minutes, other guests would start ordering the same type of drink, even though they had previously preferred a completely different brand. In Los Angeles stores, experimenters hid video cameras near the chip displays. As soon as several customers stopped at a particular flavor, the flow of people to that spot increased several times over. During elections in Seattle, journalists analyzed how a line at a polling station influenced people's decisions. If one booth had more people standing in line, new voters were more likely to go there, assuming it was the better or correct location, even though the conditions inside were identical. The crowd phenomenon is so powerful that even when decisions involve finances, food, or simply choosing a line, most people prefer not to stand out and instead copy the actions of others. The more people around you who hold the same position, the harder it becomes to go against them, even if you internally disagree. Gradually, a chain reaction begins. Someone agrees just for show, the second person looks at the first, and the third starts to imitate them. This is how waves of mass decisions are formed, almost completely erasing individual preferences. But when there is an acute shortage of time, choices become even more spontaneous. And it turns out that our decisions follow completely different rules. When there is almost no time left to think, the brain switches to emergency decision mode and all the laws of logic take a back seat. In the early 2000s, a group of researchers from Texas organized an unusual experiment. Participants were shown 2 colors on a screen and asked to quickly choose the one they found more pleasant. If a person hesitated for even a couple of seconds, the experimenter would start counting 1, 2, 3. Those who made their decision in a split second later could not explain the reason for their choice. The answers were random, but most confidently claimed, "This is the color I like." But if they were given time to think, participants more often chose the colors they had previously seen in advertisements or on product packaging. In Chicago offices, sales trainers were conducting training sessions. Employees had to choose from 4 answer options within 5 seconds, otherwise the task was considered a failure. As a result, most decisions were dictated by first impressions or habit. Managers grabbed the most familiar option. Similar methods were used in New York call centers to speed up call processing. Employees began to rely more on ready-made templates, and their decisions became less individual and unexpectedly uniform. An even clearer example can be seen on the roads. In Los Angeles, traffic cameras recorded drivers' behavior at traffic lights when the yellow light came on. Almost 8 out of 10 people decided whether to go or stop in less than a second, relying solely on their instant feeling of whether they would make it or not. If the police stopped a car and asked about the reason for the decision, almost no one could explain their actions. The brain was literally acting on autopilot. During the cooking competitions in Houston, the final round was held in a rapid-fire decision-making format. You had to quickly decide which ingredients to use. Cameras showed that even experienced chefs grabbed whatever was closest. Later, in interviews, they admitted, when time is limited, you don't think about whether the ingredient is suitable. You just grab what you're already trained to use. Military exercises at Fort Benning were conducted with a strict time limit for decision-making. Officers had no more than 3 seconds to give an order. The result? Most often they chose standard familiar scenarios, even if they weren't optimal for the new situation. After the debriefing, it turned out that no one had time to analyze. They simply acted according to ingrained patterns. At a psychiatric clinic in Dallas, researchers studied the impact of decision speed on patients' emotional states. All participants were given 2 options for resolving a conflict, but the time to choose was limited to a single breath. Most chose the first option that came to mind, and then started looking for reasons to justify why they acted that way. Later, they compared these results with those of people who made their choices without rushing. The outcomes of the decisions were drastically different. In large supermarkets in New York, signs were placed at the checkout counters reading 5 seconds left until closing. Shoppers started grabbing the nearest items without thinking about whether they actually needed them. Online stores use a similar strategy, where a countdown timer forces the customer to make a decision in just a few seconds, and conversion rates increase by almost a third. When time is running out, the brain takes over with automatic reactions, pushing logic and reflection aside. This manifests itself in various areas, from simple purchases to complex military exercises and corporate decisions. A quick choice often turns out to be less a conscious decision and more the result of ingrained habits, the pressure of the moment, and environmental influences. But even under these conditions, when it seems that the choice is entirely ours, there are always invisible levers working behind the scenes, guiding every decision and nudging us toward the desired outcome. But behind all the visible rush, the pressure of the crowd, and even our own fear of making mistakes, there are always forces that almost imperceptibly steer our decisions. In the laboratories of Princeton University in the early 90s, researchers subtly altered the conditions of their experiments. In some cases, the room smelled of fresh bread. In others, there were books laid out. The result was astonishing. Under the influence of simple scents and minor details, the volunteers made completely different choices, even though they were convinced they were acting purely logically. A well-known experiment in Boston. Students choosing between identical products were influenced by the color of the lamp above the table. Where the light was slightly warmer, people more often chose the more expensive product. The brain perceived the atmosphere as trustworthy. In the largest supermarket chains in New York, employees deliberately adjust the sound level to encourage quick purchases in the evening and create a sense of coziness in the morning. According to covert measurements, in stores with smooth music, people were twice as likely to choose products from the end of the aisle rather than at the entrance. Similar scenarios are programmed in online stores as well. They change the order in which products are displayed, add limited time offers and timers. As a result, even experienced shoppers don't notice how they're being nudged to make the desired choice. In London, an insurance company tested several versions of letters to clients, offering them to purchase insurance. Some letters began with a reminder of the risks, while others started with a description of the benefits. Where the emphasis was placed on safety, the response rate was almost half again as high. In San Francisco, HR managers changed the arrangement of chairs during interviews. If the candidates sat closer to the window, they were more likely to agree to less favorable terms, literally without realizing that the comfortable environment was influencing their internal sense of consistency. Another series of experiments was conducted in Chicago. At school breakfasts, healthy and high-calorie dishes were swapped in their positions. At the same time, teachers would say, "Follow your taste." Children were twice as likely to take whatever was placed at the intersection of two table lines. These spots were specifically highlighted with soft lighting, and the brain would choose the path of least resistance. Similar invisible levers operate out on the street as well. In New York, road signs with a bright red border made pedestrians cross the street much more often where city traffic organizers wanted them to. In Los Angeles' advertising industry, marketers launch so-called tangential campaigns, where the desired brands appear in the background of popular shows or at music festivals. A month later, viewers are more likely to buy that product, although in surveys, almost no one remembers where they learned about the brand. Even government agencies use similar methods. In Boston, the city hall placed free water dispensers in front of subway stations. Later, in the elections, those who used the dispensers were more likely to vote for the campaign's initiator. In any large company or urban system, decisions are shaped not only by personal preferences, but by a whole system of subtle, almost invisible signals. The right lighting, a banner at the checkout, a scent, music, a box of the right color, even the salesperson's tone of voice. Each of these details triggers a chain reaction in the brain, nudging you toward a certain choice. And when it seems like you've finally made a conscious decision, sometimes just a single glance, sound, or scent is enough for everything to follow a different scenario. It turns out that our choices are not isolated acts of will, but a complex mosaic where invisible mechanisms guide us every day, even when we are confident in our own freedom.